Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Linda Goff and the president of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society. And we welcome you to this afternoon's program, Women Rabbis Building Communities in the 21st Century, with Dr. Miria Kano. And there'll be a more formal introduction of her in just a moment. But I'd like to thank in particular Sarah Leiter, who's a member of our organization and who helped put this program together. And she's also co-chair of our programs committee, along with Ron Duncan Hart, who will come on in just a moment. For those of you who are members or who are not, I'd just like to make a pitch for our upcoming fall conference in conjunction with the Texas Jewish Historical Society. It'll be held virtually October 30th and 31st, and the theme is West of Hester Street, the Galveston Movement and Jewish Immigration in the Southwest. And information can be found on our website. We have people from all over the US joining us today from the East Coast, West Coast, and we have two women rabbis, Rabbi Lynn Kantrowitz and Rabbi Malka Drucker, and Rabbi Jack Schlachter, who have joined us this afternoon. So that's a special welcome to those folks. So let me then turn it over to Ron Duncan Hart, who is the other co-chair of our programs committee. So Ron, it's all yours.
Thank you, Linda. And it's my pleasure today to do the introduction of Dr. Miria Kano. Thank you, Sarah, for recommending her. And this is going to be a most interesting time to revisit some of recent history here. Dr. Kano is an assistant professor of the Division of Epidemiology, Biostatistics, and Preventative Medicine at the UNM School of Medicine. And in fact, she's a graduate from UNM and the bachelor's degree. She did a Master of Arts in anthropology and then later a doctorate, a PhD in anthropology. And her focus in the PhD research was on the women rabbis in New Mexico and their role in building the community here. And that degree was with awarded distinction. It's a pleasure to welcome Assistant Professor Dr. Miria Kano.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me today. It's my privilege to be here, and I'm so lucky and fortunate to be joined by Rabbi Kantrowitz and Rabbi Drucker, who were part of this project and my collaborators on this. And thank you, Sarah, for inviting me to participate in this. This is really, as Ron pointed out, my work over the last 8 years has really been at the Cancer Center, working in cancer health disparities primarily. So to revisit this work was really such a joy because I haven't had the opportunity to do that in quite a while. And I remember just how rich and wonderful this work is and how wonderful it was to be so engaged with these communities. So unlike most of the presentations you've probably had through the Historical Society, as an anthropologist and a medical anthropologist now, the way I've always viewed history is not necessarily in a historical momentary place, but as a lived historical moment. So this actually emerged through a life history project with the women rabbis. And so it actually was over almost a 10-year period of time working with each of them and their communities. And so today, since I don't have time to present all of that in this very brief time, I thought I would really highlight some of the stories that they told and then some of the ways that they used their stories to create a Jewish community in the margins of the New Mexico Jewish community and how different that is now. The other interesting part about this is that we were just talking before everyone else came to join us about just how this work was 10 years ago and 15 years ago now, and how much things have changed politically over the last 10 years. And in particular for women rabbis, but also just for society more broadly. And you'll see some of that just in this work because now there is more entree for women rabbis than there was at the time when I was working. These women were definitely part of the first and second generation of women rabbis, and they were trailblazers at the time, and definitely here in New Mexico, they definitely were. So I always approach this by saying, this dissertation was a product of our collaboration and their willingness to be open with me into their lives and into their communities. And so with that, I'll go into my talk a little bit. So I began working with Rabbi Lynn Gottlieb, who was one of the first 7 women rabbis to be ordained a rabbi in 2001. She was a renowned storyteller and a founding rabbi of Congregation Nahala Shalom. And at the time, I really believed that the work I was going to do was going to be about Jewish storytelling. So this project wasn't even on the horizon. I started working with her because of her storytelling. That's how I was recommended into her community. But then on September 11th of that same year, the United States was rocked when Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 passenger planes for suicide attacks in New York and Washington, D.C. And people around the world watched in horror and disbelief as buildings collapsed amid searing flames and curling smoke, and the weight of the atrocity took hold in the hearts and minds of many. And the word terror entered the national discourse in a new and aggressive way, and as fear and anti-Muslim sentiment were perpetuated by politicians, the media, and through daily discussions, which we still really see now. And in the face of this catastrophe, though, Lynn, a Jewish feminist and anti-war activist, remains steadfastly committed to her peace work, which is one of the main parts of her rabbinate. She approached members of the congregation, Nahala Shalom, and she asked, what can we as a congregation do about this situation? And all expressed a desire to connect with the Muslim community. And Lynn met with Imam Abdul Rauf Campos Marchetti, who is still very active today, and I know has worked with Rabbi Kantrowitz as well through the Muslim-Jewish dialogue. And so they planned a Muslim-Jewish peace walk. And so on April 13th, 2002, I joined a crowd of more than 250 people representing numerous religions and political positions who arrived at Congregation Nahala Shalom to make the 6.6-mile pilgrimage of peace from the synagogue to the Islamic center of Albuquerque. So Lynn stood at the doors of the synagogue with Islamic leaders and indigenous spiritual leaders, leading songs, offering prayers for peace. They released doves. It was a major presentation. And engaged as I was, I could not help but overhear the woman next to me turn to her husband and mutter, "What in the world is she wearing?" And I stepped back and I thought, unbelievable that this is the comment that we're getting in the middle of this situation. And I looked at Lynn. Whoops. I think, there we go. Come on. Here she is. And I took in her attire. This is on that day, taken by Carrie Hertz, who was on the peace walk with me. So you can see what Lynn's wearing: red dress, t-shirt, sneakers, because we walked 6.5 miles, and a white bowler hat. And at the time I thought, this is, a reflection of Lynn's very natural eccentricity, but my curiosity about the comment and about the rabbi stirred, and a different project started to emerge in my mind. As we walked, I listened, and a few people in passing cars shouted obscenities at us. Others within our group commented about the rabbi's voice, her appearance, her relationship status, and a few of them commented about her rabbinic focus. And I realized that in the midst of the beautiful and significant ritual designed to call for peace against the backdrop of grief and war and racism, the rabbi herself, and not necessarily the event, was the focus of much of the attention. So the Peace Walk was the first public organized interfaith effort in New Mexico, and one of the first in the country to publicly address interfaith relations of 9/11. And the congregation's position was not appreciated by many in the broader community at the time. Lynn was actually dubbed, and I heard it myself, as the Palestinian rabbi, and people didn't appreciate her direct focus and her her communication style about the issues. And some members of Nahala Shalom feared retribution, and they even questioned me about what my role was in the community. And I was confronted about being a member of the FBI or the CIA. And I said, I am a graduate student. I am none of those things. So at the time, the 9/11 brought up a lot of fear in the community and a lot of other feelings that were going on. So I decided that this was definitely a project that I wanted to take on. What were the motivations for Lynn to be a rabbi in such a contested space, and for her to build, to work so hard to build a community? And then how about other women? What was it about other women? Were they having the same shared experience? Was it likewise contested, or was this a reflection of Lynn and Lynn's rabbinic style? So just moving back a few years, let's go back to 1972. And in the wake of the women's and civil rights movement and Jewish feminist movements, that's when we really see women become rabbis. So before that date, there were no women rabbis in the United States. In 1972, as a result of the women's movement, the civil rights movement, and the feminist movements, there was finally that opening that allowed the first woman rabbi to be ordained, and that was Sally Prezand in 1972. And the interesting part about Sally Prezand's story is she always says, I didn't do this because I was a feminist. I didn't do this to make a gendered, this wasn't about making a gendered plea. I did this because I wanted to be a rabbi. So her entire focus was just being a spiritual leader. And it really went to show me that there was such a difference between everyone's motivations at the time. I mean, Lynn wanted to be a spiritual leader as well, but Lynn is much more of an activist and was definitely a dyed-in-the-wool feminist. So I wanted to know more about all of this. So let's start with Lynn as the first woman that I started working with. But since that time in 1972, I can tell you now that there's more than 1,000 women rabbis ordained, and that this shift was both a catalyst and a consequence of a dramatically changing American Jewish milieu of the mid-late and 20th century. And that was what I was really looking at, that how have these women been part of that change, and how were they also educated and responsible for this change? How is all of this part of their stories? And so between 2001 and 2012, I worked with Rabbi Lynn Gottlieb, Rabbi Malka Drucker, Rabbi Shefa Gold, Rabbi Kantrowitz, and Rabbi Deborah Brin, and their communities, Congregation Nahala Shalom, Hamakom, and Kol Zimra, to answer those questions. So I also thought, what is different about Judaism today? And if I look historically, there are many changes that lead to women's ordination, really starting in the 1800s with the Haskalah and Jewish Enlightenment, and also with Jewish immigration to the United States. But really, even starting in 1945, Rabbi Dana Evan Kaplan begins his book about contemporary American Judaism, transformation and renewal, by stating simply, American Judaism has changed drastically. He says that after the war, people began to reconsider religious identities into which they were born, discovering that it was possible to adopt new identities as a result of greater geographic mobility, intermarriage, changing social values, and in this case, changing Judaisms. And so it's no longer something that you were ascribed or born into or that you achieved. It could be a composite of these different identities. And that's what starts to change in America, according to Rabbi Kaplan. And so he says that it's a shift from believing in a religion that has an established church and set of rituals to a privatized spirituality. And that's really what you see. And I just wanted to plant that seed before I start telling these stories, because you see that play out in the rabbi stories, because each of their stories about Judaism shows how personal that Judaism and that path of spirituality has been for all of them. So Rabbi Lynn began her story by saying in her life history, thinking about the track that my life took, probably the most salient aspect of my youth, and it's really a saving grace in a lot of ways, was growing up in a household where my mother was a puppeteer and taught children's theater. From a very early age, I was on stage and in the midst of a storytelling culture. In high school, I produced creative services. I was the love of my rabbi. I was inspired and very, very passionate. about trying to understand good and evil and the world and why Vietnam and India and hunger, the Holocaust and death and destruction. So there really was early on a fusing of what later became Rabbi Lynn. Then of course there's the rabbi story itself, she said, which happened when I was 14. We were in a confirmation class with Rabbi Stephen Schaefer. It was organized so that the confirmation class would present the Shavuot services, and he had pre-written 10 speeches for the 10 commandments for however many students they were. She waits a couple minutes, then says, and there must have been around 10. And it was a miracle. A couple of us, another kid who eventually became a rabbi, didn't want to take the pre-canned speeches. We wanted to write our own naturally. And mine was called Man and the Moral Law. And it was kind of a narrative poem. I remember one line where I dramatically said, why this, Mother Nature? And I went on to rattle off the terrible things in the world I saw. And I read it with the dramatic fervor of having one who had been trained since the age of 6 to perform on stage. So naturally, I gave a stirring performance compared to most of the kids who could barely talk and were about to faint. So after I gave this speech, people clapped and I thought, amazing, great. And there I was. I approached the bima, I step up, the ark is open. Behind the Torah, it says, know before whom you stand. The eternal light is hanging down. And the 10 commandments are above that, and they're in white and marble and gold, very beautiful. And Rabbi Schaefer looks at me and says, Lynn, you have a poetic soul, and I hope we will be friends throughout our lives, and someday you will be a rabbi. And when he said those words, with the ark open and the congregation clapping, it just kind of sealed the direction, and I never looked back. It has always been the path I've walked. So Rabbi Lynn Begamer began her rabbinic studies in 1972 at Hebrew Union College, then later at the Jewish Theological Seminary. But she didn't find the educational opportunities she was searching for, so she studied privately with Orthodox, conservative, and Reform scholars, and received private ordination from Rabbis Everett Gendler and Zalman Schachter Shlomi. Having worked as the spiritual leader of Temple Beth Or of the Deaf in Queens, New York, she had a national reputation as a feminist and a trailblazer, and was featured on the cover of Lilith magazine in 1977, wearing a talit and a kippah, under the heading, Why is the Jewish Theological Seminary afraid of this woman? She was featured again as the new Jewish woman in Keeping Posted and in Newsweek as well in 1977. So invited by a small group to lead services in New Mexico and tired of being on the circuit, Lynn relocated to New Mexico, and the congregation chronicled the experience, saying that a small group in 1982, a small group of families, feminists, gays, and lesbians were in quest of a welcoming place to practice inclusive Judaism. And they said in the early 80s, in the 1980s in America, that was indeed a grand quest. We heard about Rabbi Gottlieb, one of the first women rabbis to practice non-sexist, ecologically responsible Jewish peace culture, and we invited her to Albuquerque, and the journey began. So congregation Nahala Shalom means inheritance of peace, and they welcomed Lynn warmly, but other members of the larger community were not very pleased by her entree into the society. But this is Nahala Shalom, which is on Rio Grande. And if you've been there, I'm sorry my pictures are so dark, but I didn't get a chance to run over and take new pictures. But it's a beautiful synagogue, and they bought it and totally fixed it up themselves. But a storyteller by trade, Lynn came into the community and she showed up for the first public situation in a red Guatemalan top and some black harem pants, and told the story about Lilith, which she performs while twirling and whooping and telling everyone that when Adam asked Lilith to assume the missionary position, Lilith refused and was banned from the Garden of Eden, and she proclaims her the first divorcee. And apparently that was very offensive to a lot of people that were there in the audience. And so from that point on, some people started calling for Lynn to no longer be a rabbi, that they questioned her ability to be a rabbi, who had actually given her permission. And so there was actually a letter circulated at the time calling for her to be relieved of her rabbinic position in New Mexico. So Lynn actually went around and got the names of 75 other people to sign on to certify that she was indeed rabbi that had been ordained. And so the claim was dropped immediately, and Lynn was allowed to stay in New Mexico. So Lynn continued to serve at that community for another 25 years. And when Lynn left, she left in 2006 because she was really interested in doing much more peace work. And she moved to California. She was also ready to retire from, I think, the day-to-day synagogue operations. So she moved to California and started doing kind of global peace walk things, and then moving around also with her son, Nathaniel. And now she's a grandmother. She has a brand new grandbaby. So she is happy as can be with her choice. But when she left, Rabbi Deborah Brin came in to take over and moved into her space. So when Deborah came in, Deborah was one of the first ordained women Reconstructionist rabbis. She's an openly lesbian rabbi involved in early Jewish feminist movement, LGBTQ movement, and in the environmental movement. And she finds it amusing that when compared to Lynn, she is considered normative. She says that Deborah describes Nahala Shalom as a good fit. And she's not there at the time, so we have to keep this in consideration. Nahala Shalom has many rabbis at the moment, including men and Shefa, but not anyone full-time. So she says, we're always going to be on the edge. We're edgy folk. I used to joke, we're seat. This was about myself when I first came out, but it's also about Nahala Shalom. It's always going to be on the edge, but being on the edge, you're still part of the fabric. And I always love that quote because that really describes the community of Nahala Shalom. These are people who still want a Jewish identity and are very committed to Jewish practice, but in a very different way than some of our other congregations here. And so I really felt that Deborah was, really understood that about that. And so I thought it was a wonderful thing. So Deborah said, when we were having coffee one day, she said, I've been having coffee with other people in the Jewish community. She says that they say that they're glad I'm the new rabbi and interested in supporting the congregation. She adds with a chuckle that they're clear that it's not the kind of place they want to be, but they know that it's the one shul in town that makes it possible for people who have a mixture of identities in their family to be part of the Jewish world. And that's important for them. So they recognize that we have just different needs for people. And I think that goes towards the shift that I was talking about earlier on, this shift into a very personalized spirituality, a different kind of Judaism, which I write about a lot, but don't have so much time to go in today, but I'm happy to have the conversation. But so one of the other ways that I looked at personal narratives was not just when people were telling stories about themselves, but also how they use those stories to shape their Jewish communities. And one of the main ways that people really do that, and all rabbis do it, it's not just women rabbis, so I'm certainly not making that claim, is when people are writing sermons. And so I think that's one of the things that Deborah does particularly well. This is Deborah getting ordained with her parents, which I love that picture, and Deborah with her partner Yael and her sister. But one of Deborah's High Holiday sermons, I think, was really wonderful. So I'm going to share that. It's called How This Rabbi Prays. What I want to talk about this morning is how to open the window to prayer. The Yiddish word is davenen, which can simply mean prayer, or it can mean a constant effort to experience God no matter what you're doing. Reb Zalman calls the art of praying davenology, and this is what this generation needs, a guide to giving us the experience that brought our ancestors into ecstatic relationship with God. When we no longer had a place for animal sacrifice, we found a new way to draw near to the beloved through sung words that came straight from the heart. The prayer book became our love song to God, but do we still find God in the Siddur? My beloved teacher, Harold Schulweis, writes, where do I begin? Where do I find God? Where do I begin to pray? Praying, like living, is a creative activity that requires concentration, honesty, and a willingness to be vulnerable like a child. This morning, I'll share how I am wrestling with traditional texts to find my prayer. The prayer we began the service with, acknowledgement of our magnificent bodies, that have sight as well as insight, that stand erect and direct us to good deeds. Without our bodies that include our brains, how would we exist? I begin davening with the moment I am aware that I am here, and I start the journey to God by noticing and appreciating my miraculous container. The first thing I do upon awakening is to say thank you. I'm here again. You give me breath and consciousness today, even before I know why. You've done it with compassion and abundant faith, and I'll do something to make the world better today. If you believe in me, how can I be less? When I reflect upon my return consciousness and upon the intricacy of communication, I know as awareness I am no longer alone. This is how I find access to invisible support. What I'm describing is intimate. It isn't out there or up there, but within me. I have a sense of the part of myself that feels interconnection. To put this more boldly, I am God and so are you. To reach the godly part of myself, I dress to get in the mood. I put on a talit, imagining God's talit as the light of the world, and I've got a little piece of it. As we did this morning, I put it over my head and the blessing, and it feels like the wings of the mother eagle taking me to the highest place. When I place the shawls on my shoulder, I feel different, and I am ready to move into the God field, to place the most transparency and vulnerability. I feel open, loving, relaxed, even cozy. It's here that I can and must tell the truth. I am going to meet the indwelling one, the place where I feel, where I experience my heart. Am I grateful that I have the desire and the freedom to pray, to take a few minutes to remember who I am? Or am I more conscious of an unresolved disagreement from the day before? I scan my body and I'm surprised to discover some dull ache or discomfort that I'd removed from consciousness. What else am I not noticing about me? Praying stops my obliviousness and calls me to deeper awareness. So the way the rabbis were using stories to tell me, when they told their life story, it was their life story in all of their way, but it was also a way of shaping who they were and why they became rabbis. As we saw in Lynn's story about how she became a rabbi, how she was called when she was 14. And then I also started to notice in the totality of their life stories that they were really everyone was building on what it was. And we do that. It's a way that we build coherence when we tell stories about ourselves. Things make sense. They build on one another until we get to where we're going, and they make sense in the outer world. So that, it was a real shift going from Lynn, who was this very external activist, to Rabbi Brin, who was much more an internal service-oriented rabbi. So I thought it was great that Nahala Shalom got to experience the poles of both of those. And I think they still do, because I think Shefa and Min both bring very different aspects of Judaism to Nahala Shalom as well. So I think that's one of the wonderful things about having so many teachers and so many spiritual leaders. So a mere hour away, Rabbi Malka Drucker founded Hamakom, the place for passionate and progressive Judaism to fill a gap in the Santa Fe Jewish world. Whereas Lynn was without pre-existing relationships in New Mexico community, Malka had served as a lay leader at Temple Beth Shalom, a Reform synagogue, for 6 years as she studied for the rabbinate. The author of 20 books, she began her rabbinic studies in her 40s. And many changes occurred in Malka's life over the next 10 years. She divorced her husband and began a relationship with her then partner, and went to the Academy for Jewish Religion in New York and was ordained and returned to New Mexico in 1998. She believed that Beth Shalom would create a space for her, but was deeply affected when told that there was no paid position, that she could volunteer as a teacher, but not as a rabbi, even though the congregation was without a rabbi at that point. Malka says, I didn't have a place to go or anything to do. Beth Shalom asked her to serve with a male congregant, and although he was not a rabbi, he told her, there can only be one rabbi. You're the associate rabbi. She served with him for 6 months without pay. The board then voted to give her a 1-year contract, yet rescinded the offer. She recounts, within 48 hours, it's overturned and there's going to be a search. Malka sent in her portfolio and waited several more months to be interviewed. The search committee led focus groups and sent questionnaires to the 400 members of the community. After 8 years of serving the community, Malka withdrew her application after being told that the search committee did not know when they would get around to interviewing her. Malka was quartered by congregation Bet Tikva the following year, only to be disappointed once again. The congregation who rented space at Capital Christian for the high holidays was forced to let Malka go when the fundamentalist Christian church sent a letter to the board. She remembers the letter as reading, "This is a very, very difficult letter to write. We love you, we love your people. We always want you here, and yet we have heard from one of our congregants that you have a lesbian who you have just hired. And of course you understand, we cannot have a homosexual any more than a fornicator or adulterer preach from our pulpit." Having been hired, Malka was unceremoniously unhired, and the second rejection caused her to go back into therapy, she tells me. "I was nuts. I mean, there was a spiritual betrayal of a type." The same year, 9/11 occurred, and Rabbi Drucker started basically having a Jewish community in her backyard. So she says, "I built a sukkah and 80 people came to the rabbi's house for the holidays. She was asked to host a Hanukkah party, and again, more than 80 people showed up. So Malka went to St. Bede's, which is an Episcopal church known for its openness to non-traditional families, and Father Richard Murphy welcomed Malka's community. And 7 years later, Hamakom still calls St. Bede's home. And now Malka has retired as well, but I know that Hamakom is still there and was a tremendous community. And so Hamakom, like Nahala Shalom, is left at the center due to a slightly feminized congregation. They have more women than men in the congregation. Women outnumber men 2 to 1, has a larger LGBTQ membership, but the membership continues to grow. And one of her community, Malka tells me, "Hamakom showed me that now I have the opportunity for the laboratory. I could cook something new. I didn't have to fit a job description. I didn't have a tradition to fit. People who gathered here all had something in common that is inchoate, that longing. They were here because they really liked what was going on. It was my kind of Judaism that was frankly traditional in practice, yet completely egalitarian and intellectually challenging. And most of all, where you could try out being the person you really wanted to be, the one you were born to be." From Malka's description of Hamakom, you really get the sense for the deep spiritual exploration of that sovereign self, that kind of personal longing. And I spent many years actually at high holidays at both of these synagogues. And I can tell you that I had very different experiences at both, but the communities were really amazing at both of those synagogues. And I know that it's true, that the linkage between the communities was incredible. The interesting part about both of these communities also is that they created communities outside of the mainstream, not because they necessarily wanted to, but because they had to. Malka tried to get a position at an existent synagogue in the community, but was denied twice, and so then created a community at the margins as a result of not being allowed into the mainstream synagogue in a paid capacity. I think that's very different now, but at the time it wasn't. We still had more of those barriers. And so I think that is one of the things that, you really get a sense of when you read the entire manuscript about what was happening with her. And if she's here, I'm happy to let her speak to that. But when she retired, I know that everyone was really very sad about it, and that she too went to be a grandmother and to spend more time with her family, which is amazing. So the other two rabbis who are part of this have likewise created kind of alternative Jewish communities and not necessarily been full-time pulpit rabbis. Rabbi Shefa Gold is really known for creating Shabbatones and going around the country and doing teaching. She lives in Hamas Valley, but she goes all around the country doing 3 or 4 day Shabbatones where they're kind of deep, prayerful and chant-led services around different holidays where she takes you through the Jewish calendar. She's the director of C-Deep, the Center for Devotional Energy and Ecstatic Practice in Hamas Springs. She's known for her liturgical compositions and spiritual teachings, and has written a number of prayers that you've probably seen in the prayer books. She conducts workshops and has published ebooks on chanting, devotional healing, building spiritual community, and meditation. And so for Shefa, I wanted to I don't have too much more time because I promised I would be 30 minutes, which I'm already over on. But I wanted to just give you a little snippet into just her beginning story about who she told me she was, because she constructed her origin story around her friend Naomi. She says, Naomi was the one person who I shared my inner life with. And I had a very strong cosmic inner life when I was young. I had perceptions of the world that were not of this world, a sense of both time and space that was different than what everyone else was saying was reality. And it was a very dramatic thing inside me. But I was leading a very double life because it was secret. I was afraid to let anyone know what I was experiencing except with Naomi. I could talk, I could share that. Naomi and I started a society called the Bayonet Society, which means in truth, where we made vows to the truth, to commit ourselves to the path of truth. This was important because we saw the whole world as mired in hypocrisy, even when we were little. And we didn't want to become the grown-ups we saw around us. I had this identity as an artist. I didn't have the word mystic, but I think that's what I was, a mystic. It gave me this kind of freedom to do with my life what I wanted to do because I was exempt from the rules, such as you first go to high school, then you go to college, and then you have kids. I was exempt from that trajectory, so I had a real freedom. I had a place behind the house where I grew up. It was called the Gully. It was my secret place. I got a lot of comfort for having my special places with a name for every rock and every tree and every corner. I had a real sense of ownership. Naomi and I actually decided when we were very young to be rabbis, and there were no women rabbis, but we decided that we were going to be rabbis, so we went out to the park, to the duck pond, and made up services and rituals. I look back and they were all very pagan rituals that we made up. They had to do with trees and flowers and the places where we were and addressing God through nature. We would also go to the synagogue with our fathers, and my father just really loved to sing. So I would sit next to him and he would sing these beautiful harmonies. I felt like the sound of Hebrew really touched me, and I really loved singing in Hebrew. And at some point when I started to read and look at what it meant, I felt like what the book was saying was wrong. I felt like what God was talking about in the prayer book was really stupid and petty and not what God was at all, because I had experienced God to be so much more. So what Shefa is talking about just in her origin story really connects with the kind of rabbinate that she's created, this deeply prayerful one. And now I am not going to leave Rabbi Min Kantrowitz out of this, even though I only have a few moments. But Rabbi Min's, I think everyone here probably has worked with Rabbi Min and at the JCC or through Hever Kadisha or through at Nahala Shalom or any of her other positions. She has really integrated herself into the Albuquerque Jewish community in so many amazing ways, and Santa Fe Jewish community. But what I love is Min had a very different, she had 2 careers before she came into being a rabbi, and she can definitely tell these stories way better than I can. But, you know, she was an architect and she was a counselor. So she brings all of these experiences into being a rabbi, and came into a rabbi a little later in life. And so, but what I love is how part of her origin story, I think, really describes the yearning and the desire to be a rabbi and to create the space, and why she works as hard as she does. So she says, when I tell the story about how I come and where I am, I usually start with my grandfather, who came here from Russia to New York and was a tailor. He used to celebrate every Yom Kippur by going to Radio City Music Hall to see the dancing girls and then go out for a ham sandwich. He was very much a rebel and very much against formal religion of any kind, particularly against Judaism. I was brought up in an extremely secular Jewish household, kind of a bagels and lox Jewish household, where Passover was celebrated by, let's ask the 4 questions, have a cup of wine, and now it's time to eat. And the rye bread was in the bread basket next to the matzah. I was always interested in Jewish stuff, but my parents really did not support and actively campaigned against my interests. I asked to go to Hebrew school and they wouldn't let me go. And on Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, when the other kids in the neighborhood would go to synagogue, they said, well, you shouldn't go to school. It wouldn't look good for the neighbors if you went to school. So I would just get dressed up and walk around the neighborhood. I would walk around the neighborhood and I would go and stand outside the synagogue and listen. So Min, the studious and academic of her family, was constantly compared to her more athletic twin sister. And at 17, she graduated early from high school and went to college. And she says, I didn't realize it then. It took me many years to realize it, but there was some kind of pull that was there really from a very young age. I went to Hebrew school. I never had a bat mitzvah. I never went to Hebrew school. I never had a bat mitzvah. The first Shabbat service that I remember going to was in college. I went to the University of Rhode Island, which was 85 to 95% Catholic and pretty much the rest Protestant. And there were maybe 10 Jews on campus. People would ask me questions. Well, you're a Jew. What is that? And I really didn't know. So I did then what turned out to be one of my life themes. If you don't know something, run toward it. And I started learning and I joined Hillel. And so now Rabbi Kantrowitz is the author of books and runs the Hever Kadisha program, as I said, and has really done so much for healing groups around the community. And so just to kind of wrap this up, to say, you know, the women that I've talked about today over the last 10 and 15 years have really done a lot to create Jewish community in New Mexico. And now to bring it back to Nahala Shalom, Rabbi Shefa Gold and Rabbi Min Kantrowitz continue to do Shabbat services there. And so all of the rabbis have gone in and out of this community, which I think is a really beautiful thing. And you can see how everyone has really helped to keep this community strong and afloat and to make such a home for people who haven't been able to find community in other spaces here. So that's the talk. And this just shows a little bit about how people have created alternative spaces here in New Mexico and about how the stories that they tell help us to understand who they are and how they've been able to do that and to create the paths that they've been able to do. So thank you. And I'm happy to let Rabbi Kantrowitz and Rabbi Drucker answer some questions if they would like to. There's Malka. And also, and to jump in, and I'm also really happy to answer any questions you might have.
Do you have a question to either of our two guest rabbis who are here, who are subjects of the talk?
Yes, please. I think are they still here?
This is Min. I just wanted to add that Rabbi Brin was the rabbi for High Holidays at Nahala Shalom this year. So it's not like she disappeared either. She's also came back and is part of what I consider the 10-member clergy team of Nahala Shalom.
Excellent. I like it that you have a team now. I think that's the best way to do that.
I just wanted to thank you, Miria, for today and for the work that you've done. And I have to admit that when you first told me what your dissertation was going to be about, I thought you were kidding. And even now, when I tell people about your reaching into this gigantic community of women from northern New Mexico who happen to be rabbis, and that we could like fill maybe a small closet at best. But I also remember we had that wonderful dinner of all of us together, and Shefa saying, you know, some of us have lawyers, some of us have doctors, some of us have CPAs. We have an anthropologist.
Exactly. Thank you. Yeah.
So I will jump in and say, you know, the first time I heard Shefa say, I'd like to introduce you to my anthropologist.
And then now you can say you have one too.
Right. So Sarah Leiter asked, what is it about the context of New Mexico you think has allowed women rabbis to build their communities here? I mean, I'll jump in and say, you know, one of the things I love about New Mexico is that many things can happen. there are soft edges all over the place. There are unfinished pieces. And that's one of the wonders of New Mexico. So when there's an unfinished piece, creative people jump into it.
Mhm. I agree with that. Actually, I've traveled a lot actually with Lynn and Shefa. And so I've been on the coasts and Jewish communities quite a lot. And I find that they are more entrenched with older communities that have been there for much longer. And even when I've talked to the women rabbis in those communities, they've said, oh, it must be fantastic to work in New Mexico where you don't have things that have been there as long. And it's kind of a more open community, that you have more space. And I kind of think it's really a metaphor for the land we have here, right? Big open skies and big communities with lots of space for edges that we, Malka, I think I might have made a mistake on that. I was just emailing you back. I know. As I said, I've been away from this work for a little while. Whoops, you're on mute. So we were talking, so anyhow, I think that's why I was drawn to New Mexico. I actually was going to work in New York on this project first. And then I thought, no, actually, I really like the diversity of the rabbis that are practicing here and how everyone had such different rabbinates, different foci, and we're just really different individuals. And I think that's why the communities are, and the communities really reflect that. And they're also really global communities in a lot of ways. I think that's true of everyone now, that people don't just work here in New Mexico, they work more broadly than that too.
Samoa Wallach also mentions in the chat that about New Mexico being in the 60s and 70s, having out of the ordinary communities. How do you think that contributed to this process?
Well, I think it definitely contributed to Nahala Shalom at that point. I think that alternative space, it was very much a space of alterity. The communities that even when they, I love that sermon. So even when in the 60s and 70s, if you look at when they even write about the beginning of Nahala Shalom, they talk about feminists and the civil rights movement. So it is actually part of, Nahala Shalom actually kind of emerged out of those same movements that Lynn's rabbinate and activism came out of. And so, it was like to like, they drew her in because they were already part of that alternative space in the 60s and 70s, New Mexico. So I think some of those communities came together, as did, I would say, the different parts of Jewish communities too. So it was a very interesting, they talk about the gay and lesbian Jewish community at the time also coming in through that community in the early 80s.
And this is Min again. One of the things that I find really interesting is the longevity of Hamakom and of Nahala Shalom, despite significant changes in leadership over many, many years. And yet both of those communities are alive and strong and stable and different than how they have been at different parts of the past.
Yeah. And I would say also financial challenges. The thing about these younger congregations that I found is that they don't have the funds that the older congregations have. So they've really had to struggle with coming up with funds to pay rabbis an equitable salary. And that's part of this that the rabbis actually worked. I know that Malka worked for not a particularly living wage when you first started working at Hamakom, and Lynn the same. That really it was kind of an act of devotion and love building these communities, because they don't have the same funds to stand on that Congregation Albert has, that the other congregations have. So I think that was that's something that the fact that they do have this longevity is really pretty incredible, that they've been able to continue to build in the face of this. I see Bo, I see your hand up. I think you have to unmute.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, after a rather sad history of Hamakom and Temple Beth Shalom, Hamakom has been welcomed home and now is having services at Temple Beth Shalom, or when they begin to have in-person services, it's at the original sanctuary of Temple Beth Shalom. And for, excuse me, for Sukkot, there was a wonderful joint service outside with both Rabbi Friedman and Rabbi Amswich on the quote unquote bima, not quite a bima under the sukkahs, but we're glad to welcome them back. I'm sorry for the past. Thank you.
That's great. Malka, do we need to unmute you?
Yeah.
Oh.
In response to what Bo is saying is why we started Hamakom was because I served both of the better endowed congregations in Santa Fe originally, and at that time it was clear that I was way too out of town for those two congregations, and the only way we could have a congregation by my gender, for sure. There was no question about that. And I remember, since Cindy is on this as well, that when we came in with, we have a woman cantor, woman rabbi, woman president, how will that fly? I remember saying, well, it was like that for about 3,000 years for one gender. So why not? Let's see what happens. And we were the last house on the block. And yet the people who came to us were the people who were not going to necessarily fit anywhere else. And, I'm sure that in these years, that in these 10 years I've been gone, that Hamakom has evolved. But at that time, we served a very important purpose, because I don't think more than 10% of the community could have been at home anywhere else. And I see Ron Hart is here too, and he was also part of those early years of the community. But actually, he and Gloria, they could have gone anywhere. But most of the congregation would not have gone anywhere else. There was no place else that they would have felt at home.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something else that women clergy do provide. And I did the book about witches and nuns and all women spiritual leaders, and many of them said the same thing, that what they provided simply by their gender was their greatest teaching.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that was very true. I didn't include, just for lack of time, but when I actually interviewed many members of the communities that worked with all of the rabbis, and that was really what I was told when I was in all of the communities, that these rabbis and these communities provided access for them in a way that they didn't feel comfortable in other communities. So that, and it was a real gap of it was often described to me as a really painful gap, because they would say, I don't feel comfortable in a traditional synagogue, but I'm not culturally Jewish either. I feel like I really want to participate in this. And some people would say, I feel like I need to learn. And I will say for certain that Malka and your congregation, the emphasis on the bat mitzvahs and the learning that I saw over the years with you, and how people would come up and present during services, was always so beautiful and so moving. There were so many people.
Right. Somebody else, Samoa Wallach, was a very important person. I forgot that Samoa, in fact, told me about this presentation this afternoon. So she was very, very important at that time. And as for the teaching that we did, we did that teaching because we had people who came into that congregation who didn't know which way to turn the prayer book and which direction to hold it. So we had a really low bar, and I knew that if I was going to be a 25% rabbi, that congregation was going to have to get good enough to pick up 75% of everything, including leadership. And they did.
Yep, they really did. And I think that's true of there's a lot of Jewish people in New Mexico that I've spoken with that have had very much that experience, where they've come here where they grew up very secular, or they grew up, with one Jewish parent, not another, and didn't actually have that. And I think that's the same at Nahala Shalom, a different type of education, but these communities made people feel comfortable to come in and learn and to become part of something, and to do that in a unique way. So I think that it was really, I look at this and I think, when I first started, I was looking at this in terms of alterity, but I also think it's not just alterity, it's an expansion. That's why I look at this in terms of living storytelling and a living Judaism, because I think it really does just show us how the breadth of Judaism, and that's what your communities continue to create.
You mentioned earlier about something about the political shifts that have happened over the last 10, 15, 20 years, whatever. But the interesting thing is, during this time that the society is becoming more conservative, we have more and more women rabbis,
Right.
which seemed like going two different directions. Can you comment on that?
I think Judaism has always had pockets of liberality within Judaism. So I don't necessarily see all Judaism going in this socially conservative vector. And I also see, as someone who grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a place that's extremely conservative, that oftentimes when things are conservative, there have to be these liberal points of breaking. In anthropology, we look at it like when you look at Mardi Gras as a point of having some way of society escaping from conservatism. I think Judaism has always played that role in some ways, liberal Judaism, because there have always been activistic liberal Jewish voices. Really, I would, even though we talk a lot about this in terms of Reform Judaism with, 1800s and on, I would say that they've probably been in there much longer than that. That's when we can definitely look at breaks in terms of activism. But I think that that's the role Reform Judaism plays. And I think that's why we have more women rabbis now. I think there is that voice. And I think that Jewish activism and social justice, that's just part of people's Torah. That's part of the way people perform Jewish spirituality. That's part of that inner journey.
I also think that for many years, women were not allowed to even consider becoming rabbis. So there was this backlog of desire. And when the gates opened, women just flowed right in.
Mm-hmm.
And currently, most of the seminaries and all the denominations, the students, there are far more women students than men in their cantorial and rabbinic programs. And I mean, I'm taking a class right now through Aleph, a Torah class. There aren't any men in the class. I mean, things have, the pendulum has really shifted.
Well, that is true. However, I remember when I interviewed Unitarian minister about their seminary in 1999, Helen Cohen, that was her name, the minister, said that if they did not have some form of affirmative action, the class would be 90% women. And as it was, their ordaining class the year before had been 65%. And there is a great fear in this country of the feminization of religion. But that's another conversation.
It is another conversation, but you're absolutely right. And I've heard a lot about that. And, the interesting part about the feminization of religion is that a lot of the conversation around that was from male rabbis being afraid that it would drop the rabbinic salary, which I've always thought, and there you have it. When it comes down to the bottom dollar and not to the quality of the rabbi or the experience, the experience of the congregants, then you have to look at what it really is, sexism and money. So, but yes, very good point and very valid.
Well, I just want to let you all know I live in Goleta. I'm safe. Breathing isn't so easy, but I'm really grateful that I could be with you today.
Oh, I'm so glad you are both there. I'm just really happy, and it's so good to see you too, Cindy, because I haven't, it's like old home week. I get to see all the
I sort of remember being interviewed by you too at the tea house.
That's right. Exactly. No, it's wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining me. This was really a pleasure to talk to all of you. And thank you, Malka. And I made a mistake on the sermon. The one I attributed to Rabbi Brin, actually, I believe was Malka's sermon, which is what we were talking about. I'm sorry. I was trying to get all of my pieces together, but I've been away from this work for about 9 years. So
the source is always from the same place, Miria, no worries.
Yes, okay. And I love that sermon.
I'm so glad.
Well, if I may jump in, Miria, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for a delightful program, and for all of you, in Hollywood Squares, as we see you, for sharing your thoughts, and Malka and Min and others. It's been a pleasure, and we thank you. So again, on behalf of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society, thank you, Miria, and everyone here today who joined us. And be safe, and hope to see you in person one of these days.
That would be nice.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.